Hello everyone and welcome to D&D Builds, where we make ridiculous builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, so I can have an outlet to share these builds without constantly driving the people in my life insane. Today we're diving into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with everybody's favorite doctor with a goatee every man in the 90s would have killed for, crushed hands, and an ego the size of New York, Dr. Strange. Quick disclaimer, we are going with the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Doctor Strange, not the comic book one, just because there are a million different versions of Doctor Strange in the comic books with tons and tons of spells, and nobody has time for that. So let's just dive in. Doctor Strange's history, he's a human doctor, so we're going to take variant human, and the feat we're going to take with that is healer. Healer will allow us to use a healer's kit to stabilize somebody or return some hit points. Their skill we're going to take as a human is medicine. Obviously, he's a doctor. And if he's a doctor, that just kind of makes sense. As far as a background, we're going to go cloistered scholar. That gives us proficiency in 2 more skills. We're going to take history and nature. Dr. Strange makes a point of saying he has an eidetic memory, so he needs proficiency in history so he can recall all of that knowledge. Cloistered Scholar also gives you library access, which you're going to need as you're sneaking around stealing tons of books. One of the pieces of equipment you get with this background is a borrowed book with your current area of study. First things first, before we jump into the stats, we need to clear the air about one thing. He's known as the Sorcerer Supreme, and that's great and all, but in the world of D&D, sorcerers don't work this way. He does channel some magical energy through him, which is great and all, but the way he learns his spells is from actually studying and researching, and the only people that do that in D&D are wizards. Sorcerers just kind of have that inner power, and they just pull it out of them. So, he's not the Sorcerer Supreme here, he's the Wizard Supreme.
So Earth has wizards now.
The preferred term is Master of the Mystic Arts. You can leave that now.
All right, wizard. Who are you? Why should I care?
With that out of the way, let's jump into some stats. It's going to be pretty easy to go about this. Even though his hands were crushed, he was a doctor and he was a surgeon. They need very dexterous hands to be able to perform the amazing surgeries that he pulls off. Since he is very quickly going to be gaining the use of his hands back thanks to harnessing some magical energy, we're going to go ahead and skip the no dexterity version of Doctor Strange and put a handful of points in. This is also going to help him avoid getting damaged in the future. We're going to put 15 points into dexterity and then get an additional +1 with our human variant. We're going to get 14 into Constitution. He's not super squishy, and he is able to concentrate pretty well, despite failing a few times here and there. And he can endure some torture from one of Thanos' minions. Lastly, we have Intelligence as his other primary stat. We're going to put 15 into this, get another +1 from our human variant choice. And then as far as Wisdom, we're just going to take 10. He's not the wisest. He makes some terrible decisions that most people wouldn't make sometimes, but that doesn't mean he's completely terrible with his wisdom. So we'll leave it at 10, which is pretty baseline. You might notice I left off strength and charisma. He is not exactly Mr. Strength, so we're going to dump that at 8, giving him a -1 ability modifier. And nobody seems to like him very much when they first meet him.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
So charisma's going to get that 8 as well, giving him another -1 there. We're not going to go level by level like we did with our Batman build, because we know all the stats he's going to take. It's just going to go into Intelligence and then Constitution, so he can hopefully concentrate a little. And since we know stats, and we know he's a wizard, the big things to worry about with wizard are what school to take and what spells to take. So that's going to be the primary focus of this build. Let's jump into some of his abilities and see what we're getting into. He's got a fancy sling ring, a fancy cloak of levitation, and a kick-ass never-ending beer glass. So we're going to have to figure out a way to address all 3 of those things. And since we've already established that he's going to be a wizard, not a sorcerer, let's jump into the wizard section. He gets 2 skills right off the bat. We're going to grab Arcana and Investigation. He does do a lot of investigating into how these spells work, so I think that fits. As far as equipment, we're going to grab him the Explorer's Pack because he does take that long trek up to Camartage, and he needs a way to be able to survive that trek. When it comes to his arcane focus, we do have some choices, but really we're just going to either use the pendant around his neck, or if you want to get a little more creative, D&D did allow a bit of casting through tattoos, and he does have some interesting scars on his hands, so we can kind of tinker with that and say you cast them through the scars. But whatever you want to go with here, totally fine. Let's jump into all the abilities and all the stuff we need to address. In the original Doctor Strange movie, he has tons of abilities surrounding the Time Stone. He manipulates time, and later in Avengers Endgame, he does peer into the future and tries to figure out the best course of action. His actual spells in the Doctor Strange movie, which I had to do a little bit of research and figure out what they're actually called according to the comics, he has magic glowing whips called Eldritch Whips. Super creative naming. He has damage blocking magic that he uses pretty constantly. They are called the Ruby Rings of Ragador. He also has astral projection, and he creates portals teleporting himself and others around constantly. Lastly, in the first movie, he does have access to the mirror dimension. When interacting with Thor, he is able to cast a location spell using Thor's hair, and he busts out his fancy glass that seems to never ever run out of beer. Then finally we get to Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Throughout these two movies, he busts out a ton of spells. He makes a ton of duplicates with himself with a spell called Images of Econ. Who knows if I'm pronouncing that right? He casts a warding spell on his necklace that is supposed to contain the Time Stone. He turns damaging projectiles that Thanos fires at him into butterflies, which is actually called Hoary Hosts of Haggoth. I'm going to have a lot of trouble saying half of these as they are massive tongue twisters. He casts wind spells in both Infinity War and Endgame. In Infinity War, he uses it just to clear out a street. But in Endgame, he does it a bit more epically and creates this massive wind tornado just swirling everything up. And this spell is called the Winds of Watum. He creates a giant magic shield that protects all of his, I guess, friends, if you want to call them that, or more of associates. And this spell is called the Shield of Seraphim. He uses a spell called the Sacred Sword of Vishanti as he tries to attack Thanos. He creates some platforms for Peter Quill to jump on. Doctor Strange unleashes magical energy that arcs across boulders, making its way towards Thanos, and this spell is called the Seven Sons of Cinnabus. He attempts to pull off the Infinity Gauntlet with a spell called the Crimson Bands of Cyttorak. And I almost forgot, in the final battle of Endgame, he uses a spell called the Icy Tendrils of Ichthalon. He uses this to reach up from the ground and grab a bunch of people and pull them down. At this point, feel free to comment on how my pronunciation was super terrible. Now that we've covered all of his spells and abilities, let's figure out how we're going to make this happen in D&D. Let's figure out what specialty arcane tradition you should pick, because if we decide this now before we take any spells, it'll help guide what spells we should take later to fill in all the gaps. So there are plenty of schools of arcane tradition to fall into, but most of them don't really apply. I've never seen Doctor Strange do anything like raise the dead, so we don't really have to worry about things like School of Necromancy or anything crazy like that. The real contenders are illusion, evocation, divination, chronergy, and abjuration. All of these have their merit and can apply in one way or another, but really it comes down to abjuration, chronergy, or illusion. Abjuration is great because Doctor Strange does block a hell of a lot of spells, and he does use illusion when it comes to duplicating himself or turning things into butterflies. But frankly, just because he has the Time Stone, I can't help but go with chronergy. Chronergy, we have things like chronal shift, making you able to control the flow of time over a creature, which we see him doing when he is messing with time around an apple. We have momentary stasis, which freezes people in place, but you can't really damage them, which is a little bit of a downside, but still works. At level 10, you can condense a spell's magic into a mote, or any little stone, if you'd like. And then you can cast that spell through it later, but that doesn't really apply too much to Doctor Strange. The big thing we want to look at is convergent future. You can peer through possible futures and magically pull one of them into events around you, ensuring a particular outcome. This seems incredibly spot on for everything that happens in Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, so we're definitely going to stick with chronergy. So now that we know the arcane tradition, let's figure out what spells we need to take in order to cover everything that's in the movies. But of course, if you're playing this wizard, go ahead and fill out the spell list even more, because you're going to have way more spells to choose from, and you're going to want to make sure you have some utility and some other damaging spells just to make sure you're a bit more useful. As far as cantrips, we need to make sure we grab his magic glowing whips, aka his eldritch whips, which are really just Lightning Lure. Lightning Lure lets you create a lash of lightning energy, and you can pull somebody in with it. So this is pretty perfect. While we're on cantrips, we're also just going to grab Mage Hand, so that way we can steal those books a little easier. And this will help recreate the little floating hand to just grab a few things. For the damage blocking magic for Ruby Rings of Ragador, we're just going to go ahead and grab Shield. This seems really fitting, and we can also grab Mage Armor just to top it off. Both of them work, but I personally think Shield is a little more fitting because he actually holds it kind of like Captain America's shield, and I think it's the better choice. For the astral projection we see throughout the movies, there is just a spell called Astral Projection. So that makes that super easy to track down. As far as creating portals and teleporting himself and others, there are tons of options we have here, but there's an elephant in the room we need to address. He does cast them using his sling ring. And in D&D, there happens to be this perfectly illustrated item called the Ring of Spell Storing. It even looks just like the sling ring. We can take that Ring of Spell Storing and load it up with Vortex Warp. It's a 2nd level spell that allows you to teleport a creature. It comes from the source book, Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos. We also have other choices like Dimension Door and Misty Step and whatever else we want to grab. When it comes to accessing the mirror dimension, we have a handful of choices. We have spells like Plane Shift, which also addresses how we deal with the multiverse. We have Lemon's Tiny Hut, which can work, but like the spell says, it is tiny. So that's not the best choice. But I think the absolute best spell that will fit this is Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum. It's a 4th level abjuration spell, and it allows you to create a magical barrier that can be 100 feet on each side. We can also use Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion, but nobody wants anybody destroying your house. So let's stick with Private Sanctum. While we're in that Private Sanctum, we can move things around using spells like Reverse Gravity. So while we're in this dimension, and things are constantly moving around, we have an explanation for it. Between these two spells, we're able to recreate the mirror dimension, so we can move on to the next one. There actually is a spell called Locate Creature, which would be great for when we're trying to find Odin or Thor's dad in Thor Ragnarok. And there's actually a perfect spell called Divination, but unfortunately, you need to be a cleric to cast it. And that specifically lets you contact a god. So the fact that Thor and Odin are counted as gods in the MCU, that would have worked pretty well. But we have to stick with what we've got, and Locate Creature would be great, but it doesn't work over large bodies of water. So something that works a little better is Scrying. And this actually works great because in the movie, he uses Thor's hair to cast the spell, and there's actually an ability in Scrying to use someone's hair. Now let's rapid fire through some of these others. Images of Econ, where he makes a bunch of duplicates. We're just going to go with Mirror Image. It doesn't make as many images as we would like, but it's the closest we're going to get. To protect the time stone in his necklace, there's just a Glyph of Warding. That's pretty straightforward. When it comes to turning damaging projectiles into butterflies, that one's a little rough. We're actually going to mix Major Image with Shield. So you block the damage with Shield, and then you can create a visible phenomenon in a 20-foot cube, and that will be Major Image, which is a 3rd level illusion. When it comes to the wind spells used in Infinity War and Endgame, we can actually use 2 different ones. We have Gust of Wind for Infinity War when you clear the street with that, well, gust of wind. And then when you want to get really intense with that final battle against Thanos, you can use Whirlwind, which is a 7th level evocation. When you need to bust out a giant magic shield to protect everybody, or the Shield of Seraphim, we are going to go with Wall of Force. It makes the most sense in this situation, and it's a great defensive barrier. When you need to bust out a magic sword out of nowhere, there's a couple ways you can do this. There's Shadow Blade. Frankly, that feels a little weak against someone like the Mad Titan, so I'm actually going to go with Blade of Disaster. It's a pretty intense spell, but you don't really hold back when you're going up against big purple nutsack Chin himself. When it comes to creating platforms, there's a pretty simple spell for this. We're just going to use Tensor's Floating Disc. It's not overly exciting. I'm sure anyone that has tried to create a random disc for somebody to carry things or whatnot has immediately resorted to Tensor's Floating Disc. As far as the 7 Sons of Cinnabis, there was of course something that popped into mind the second I saw how this spell was cast, and we got to go with Chain Lightning. It even says in Chain Lightning you can bounce it off of objects. So this is perfect for how we bounce from boulder to boulder before we hit Thanos, or at least attempt to. As far as replacing the icy tendrils of Ichthalon, there's a very straightforward spell for this in D&D called Avard's Black Tentacles. It is used by pretty much any caster that wants to restrain somebody and creates a massive AoE that has a bunch of tentacles sprout up from the ground and just restrain them and hurt them. And then lastly, when it comes to the spells, we have the attempt to pull off the Infinity Gauntlet. There isn't anything that's too spot on for this, but as I was looking through, I saw that the Fathomless Warlock actually casts Bigby's hand as a giant tentacle. And that immediately sparked the idea that, oh yeah, we could just use Bigby's hand for this. There's even a grasping hand ability for this 5th level evocation spell that is Bigby's hand. And before we wrap up all of the spells, just since you have the time stone, we want to make sure we grab every time related spell. We have things like time stop, slow, haste, and while you're looking through the future, you can use your chronergy ability, but you can also use something like foresight, which allows you to see ever so slightly into the future and gives you advantage on pretty much everything. And as the ultimate spell that you'd be able to cast with your time stone, I would grab Wish. I know a lot of people hate on this spell, but that's usually because they actually take it for the name and don't really read what it does. Because Wish isn't an all-powerful thing if you read a bit more closely. At this 9th level spell, you can undo a single recent event and reshape reality itself. This is perfect when it comes to dealing with Dormammu at the end of the original Dr. Strange. Now that we've hammered out all of the spells and how they relate to D&D, we need to sort out a couple of items, because that's all that we have left and we don't want to leave them out at this point. We've already established that the sling ring is pretty much just a ring of spell storing and even looks identical. As far as the never-ending beer for Thor, we have 2 choices here. We have an alchemy jug, which is referenced in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 150, or we have the tankard of plenty from the Hoard of the Dragon Queen, page 74. Both of which will give you the ability to have an endless amount of liquid in a container, and you can even choose beer. So now that the easy one was taken care of, we need to sort out this cloak of levitation. This is a little more difficult, as you could really cheese it and get this cloak of billowing, which just makes it so it flows and looks all fancy, and then you just cast fly on yourself. Or you can cast animate object, or you can use telekinesis to move it around. But that's you controlling it, and it doesn't feel quite right. The one thing I want to really hammer home here is that the cloak can think for itself. It seems like it's actually a sentient creature. So I decided to actually go with a sentient creature instead of some random item. The trick is you'd have to befriend it, and hopefully it would fight on your side. You'd have to have a very friendly DM to pull this off. Otherwise, you're stuck casting fly on yourself, wearing a cloak of billowing, and using telekinesis. So we have a few choices as far as a sentient creature. From Fury of the Forge, you'll find a Rug of Smothering. It comes to life, it wraps around your head, and actually tries to smother you to death. That seems pretty spot on. Only issue is it doesn't fly. So we have another option, which is a Dark Mantle. It's a small monstrosity, and it has a special ability called False Appearance. While the Dark Mantle remains motionless, it remains indistinguishable from a cave formation. This is close, and we're closer, but it doesn't quite work. So what's left is we have a Cloaker. This is right on the money. It is a slightly higher level, and it is faster than the Dark Mantle, which works much better since the Cloak of Levitation does tend to whip you around pretty quickly. And it's got a bite ability that will attach to a target's head, making them blind and unable to breathe, which works way too well to not use this if your DM would let you use a cloaker as a pal for your wizard. So we did have to get a little creative there, but I think now we have every possible ability that Dr. Strange is going to have. Granted, a lot of these spells are pretty high level, and you're not going to be able to cast them all in one go, but you can only get so close to being an absolute superhero by yourself. So that's going to be today's build. Let me know if there's anything you would change, any spells I missed, and how badly I screwed up pronouncing the original names of the spells from Dr. Strange. In the meantime, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll be posting D&D builds here pretty regularly. So until next time, here's me hoping that you roll a nat 20. So long.